Good morning, everyone. Hope all of the FRQs went well for period 1. We are now going to talk about period 2, specifically 1607 to 1754, which would be the founding of Jamestown and the sort of continued colonization of the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States, up until sort of the eve of the French and Indian War, what's also known as the 7 Years' War, even though it was 9 years. So thanks, historians. We're going to start with Jamestown. Jamestown, founded in 1607 in what is now Virginia, becomes the Virginia colony. It's founded by a joint stock company called the Virginia Company. Both of those things are named for Queen Elizabeth, who was known as the Virgin Queen, so Virginia. And Jamestown was named for James I, who was the king at the time, in 1607. So the important thing to know about Jamestown is not just its sort of basics for its economy, its geography, its labor systems, etc., also in comparison to the New England colonies. So I wanted to break down the differences in the colonies to understand. Obviously, you don't have to memorize every single date of every single colony. If you have a general sense of understanding the regions they're in, the types of economies they have, how the geographies shape those economies, and the sort of the makeup of those colonies, I think that's kind of the important part. So Jamestown's first, Virginia's first. Plymouth colony up in what is now Massachusetts is founded by a group of Puritans in 1620. And in terms of the 4 areas of colonies, I would say to focus on sort of New England colonies, the Middle colonies, the Chesapeake colonies, which Chesapeake Bay is the area sort of Virginia, Maryland, and to an extent kind of Delaware, I guess, and the Southern colonies. And understanding how they are different and how those economies are different is very important for the AP test. The other thing to know is of those different colonies, how their colonial governments are set up. So you have kind of 3 different types. You have charter governments, which were based on those joint stock companies, those sort of early corporations, sort of having an agreement that they would sort of come into this new territory with. You had proprietary governments, which were governments given basically the proprietorship, the control of that land grant was given from the King of England or Queen of England to a person, usually a rich nobleman, who was then in charge of that area. That would be a place like Pennsylvania is a really good example. William Penn is given a proprietorship over the sort of what will be the colony of Pennsylvania. And then a royal colony, which is pretty straightforward. There's a royal governor who is basically in charge, who's been appointed by the king. So that's a little bit more direct in its control of the crown. So these types of colonies and their governments and their economic systems are super important to know in terms of how they are different. I've seen short answer questions based on sort of explaining the differences, explaining sort of the effects of those differences on the economies, things like that. So quickly, I want to talk about the labor systems. The labor systems of the time, obviously, you had indentured servitude, which starts to come up in the sort of early to mid 1600s as these colonies are happening. These are signed indentures. They're basically contracts signed by generally, working class to poor Europeans who are trying to come to this new world for new opportunities. And they're willing to give up, usually on average of 7 years of their lives in work. And they would come usually like late teens, early 20s perhaps. And the hope was that if they could then serve their entire indenture, then they would be able to acquire some stuff. And a lot of this stuff is in your notes that you were taking from earlier in the year, so you might want to look back on those. Obviously then we also have enslaved indigenous people, the natives in the different colonies, as well as enslaved Africans who were coming in greater numbers as we see this period moving toward the 1750s. Specifically, some important things to know are that these labor systems are really beneficial for the colonists themselves. Not just economically, because free, cheap or free labor is obviously very helpful, but also because it creates these hierarchies, political hierarchies, who's sort of powerful. You get like the landed class, the gentry class in Virginia, sort of along the banks of the James. You get, sort of the middle class. And this is where we start to get these ideas of race. Race is created as this idea of the color of your skin. Before, it was sort of where you were from. English people did not consider Irish people the same race. These are the moments where we start to see the idea of race and the way you are perceived in society as being the thing that differentiates you. And we see that with laws. Things like slave codes start to be created, especially in the Caribbean colonies of Barbados and Bermuda and Jamaica, and places where the slave population is much, much larger. And so they create these laws, the sort of local colonial governments create these laws to restrict the power that these groups could have. Specifically, there's two rebellions that I'd like you guys to know for these understandings of the sort of labor systems and how they interact in society. The first is Bacon's Rebellion. And Bacon's Rebellion is basically it's a group of former indentured servants who have been forced, because of the lack of land, out into the frontiers of Western Virginia. As they're moving back into the sort of over the hills into the sort of woods, and they are being frustrated by the colonial government, and specifically Governor William Berkeley of Virginia's support of the trade allies that have been created by the indigenous people who live there. And because the local government of Virginia is more interested in keeping those alliances, that is going to anger a lot of those poorer and middle to lower class whites who are trying to find land, who are trying to make their own way, trying to grow tobacco, trying to do whatever they can. And so this is going to lead to some real frustration and ultimately a rebellion of poor whites against sort of the colonial government of Virginia, specifically Governor Berkeley. And this is in 1676, super important. One of the reasons it's so important is because ultimately the rebellion fails. However, there is this sense now that indentured servants, when they get out of their indentures, are going to be a problem. And there's a question about what is going to happen. How do we figure out the sort of poor white anger that's existing going forward? And so this is where we see a real slow trickle of indentured servitude and into more importation of enslaved Africans. So this is where the slave population starts to grow in these sort of Chesapeake and southern colonies specifically. There's another rebellion, and that's called the Stono Rebellion. That happens in 1739, sort of started by a educated enslaved African named Jemmy, or he's also known as Cato. If you see Cato's Rebellion, this is in 1739. Basically, it's a relatively successful, to a certain point, rebellion that in Stono, South Carolina, what is now South Carolina, that leads to real questions about the rise of a larger slave population in these southern colonies, as well as education. And so you see harsh laws that start to limit Black Americans, free and enslaved, abilities to read and write, abilities to own property. We see the legitimization of chattel slavery, the child of a mother who is enslaved is now enslaved by law. And so this leads to sort of the continuation of slavery in these colonies. So those are sort of the labor systems and the basics, and obviously there's more, but I want to just kind of cover the sort of the surface, and then you guys can dig in a little bit more. Another thing I want to focus on is the sort of differences of these colonial powers. So specifically, you have in this new world, you have Spain, who's controlling what is called New Spain. It's mostly Mexico and kind of Central America and up into what is now here, California, the West Coast. You have New France, which is kind of most, if not all, of Canada, the Ohio River Valley, so it comes down kind of the Great Lakes and down all the way down into the Mississippi River. So much of the sort of northern and middle, all the way down the Mississippi River is now controlled by France. And then New England, which is the sort of eastern seaboard, all the way from kind of what is now Maine, all the way down to sort of what is Georgia. And Florida also was part of Spain's empire. And these different empires had different reasons for coming. They had different ways in which they thought about these colonies, and different ways in which they dealt with the challenges and the benefits that came to them. Specifically, you want to focus on the difference in terms of their relationships with natives. So all of them certainly dealt with native peoples. Obviously, we've talked about the encomienda system with regards to how Spain was dealing with indigenous people. The French tended to take a much more sort of hands-off approach in a lot of ways. They would set up forts all over sort of New France, Canada, Ohio River Valley, but a lot of it was really, these small pockets of fur traders. It was really about the fur trade, about dealing with indigenous peoples to benefit them. And in a lot of ways, this area was kind of called the middle ground. It was where native peoples and the French explorers of the time were kind of met on this kind of even playing field, if you will. And so they had a lot more, the indigenous people felt a lot more respected by the French generally, even though, of course, they were still trying to convert them. A lot of Jesuit missionaries from France were there in sort of these regions, but generally speaking had a better relationship because they were focused on fur trade, and the fur trade was really, really helped by the indigenous peoples. England was different, and England obviously comes for economic gains as well, along with also just sort of like, in a place like Plymouth and parts of the Puritans and the Massachusetts Bay Colony that happens in 1629, 1630. We're talking about more independence, more a new country, a new way of life. And so you see different purposes for why the English are coming and how that's going to play out with regards to the indigenous peoples. The French need the indigenous people a lot in terms of their trade. The British and the Spanish don't need them as much. The Spanish maybe need them for their labor in the gold mines of Mexico and Central America, but the English don't need the indigenous peoples as much. Besides to be trade partners, they don't need them for the same reasons that the French do. And so you see them play a much more sort of adversarial role. Keep in mind how this rivalry is going to play out, because this is really important, like how the French and English are treating the natives, how they are treating the land, how they are setting up settlements, where they're setting up, how they're setting up forts to control those areas, because those things are who they're allied with in terms of the indigenous peoples. Those are really important things to consider. And obviously the end of this period leads up to this true confrontation that's going to happen in the New World, which is the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, that starts in 1754. And the important thing from this period to remember is this is the moment where we have the first inklings of perhaps the colonies who see themselves as very separate. If you're from Massachusetts, you see yourself as a Massachusettsan or Massachusettser. I don't know how to say it. Or if you're a Virginian, you see yourself as a Virginian. You are not an American. That all comes way later. And so this is the moment where we start to think about unity, and this comes from the Albany Plan of Union that is written partially by Benjamin Franklin. We looked at that in class. So really understanding how maybe coming together to fight against the French in this coming war has the seeds of that idea of unity. So I want to now sort of pivot to this idea of the economic system at the time, specifically mercantilism. And this is a really important way of thinking about what is happening economically at the time. So basically, the basic definition of mercantilism is that mercantilism is about maximizing exports and minimizing imports. So you basically want to sell more things than you bring in. In this case, we're talking about England. England wants to sell more manufactured goods abroad than it wants to have to import manufactured goods or particular resources in. And so for them, setting up a colony like the United States is going to provide them resources that they can then turn into manufactured goods and then sell those goods back to the Americans. So in this context, if you remember our game that we played in terms of our little, we had our little labels, we were businesses or colonists, we had to sort of collect certain resources and then sell them, and then to the businesses then sold us the manufactured goods back. So we could offer our labor, our capital, and our resources. And so all of those things, that was kind of the idea of mercantilism. It's this zero-sum idea of thinking that wealth is a zero-sum game, and you want to accrue the most wealth that you possibly can. And the way that England tried to do this was that they tried to limit the opportunities that colonists could have to buy other countries' products. So if you're English, you want the Virginians to buy English products. And so you're going to put restrictions or tariffs or taxes or limitations and laws on those colonists so that they have to buy English products. So this is obviously really important. It benefits the mother country, which in this case is England, and so England is very happy to do this. And they pass a lot of laws, like the Navigation Acts of the 1600s and into the 1700s. They eventually will pass a Molasses Act of 1733, where they're trying to sort of create more taxes and limitations on these. But there's a catch, and that catch is that England was really practicing what historians call salutary neglect. And the idea of salutary neglect is that basically, while the British are passing all of these laws and restrictions on trade of the colonies, they're not enforcing them. And so it's this idea of sort of hands-off approach. So England is passing these laws, but not really enforcing them. So obviously that leads to a lot of black market, smuggling, trade. All of this stuff is really sort of under the watch of the British, and the British aren't really enforcing it. And so this leads to obviously a very flagrant abuse of all of these laws. And what happens is that at some point, with these sort of tighter restrictions, tighter enforcement of all of these laws, salutary neglect starts to lessen, and this leads to a lot of frustration in the colonies. The colonies are like, wait a minute, you left us alone. Why are you now suddenly wanting to clamp down on these things that we're English. Why should we have to pay this extra tax? And that's a really important thing too, is that they see themselves, because they are technically English. They follow common English laws. So all these extra restrictions on them they felt were completely unfair. And that it wasn't just about economic restrictions, but it was about social restrictions, philosophical restrictions. You are taxing us, you are restricting us as English people to be able to have these freedoms. And so that leads to a lot of frustration. So along with this colonial frustration, the economic and political frustration of not having your own control over laws, not having your own say in a lot of ways, as the sort of the handcuffs start to tighten on those colonial colonies, those places, you then have the First Great Awakening. And so this is where we get the social sort of changes that are happening. So this is kind of happening in the 1730s and 40s, sort of in the midst of all these things, right? And what we're talking about this, it's, the Great Awakening, but really it's the first, because there's another one that happens in the 1830s and 40s. And this one is led by preachers like Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield. These are preachers who are bringing passion back to the church, to the pulpit. Whitefield, who is coming from England, has no church, so he's out in the fields. We read that I guess, what would it be, like a live blog or whatever we read that diary entry by Nathan Cole, who was talking about hearing that Whitefield was coming to this little town in Connecticut and jumping on his horse and riding to get there and getting off, and how he has this sort of heart wound from hearing Whitefield speak. And this is the idea that all of these people are having this personal relationship with God, that it's not just about sitting in a church and sort of going through the motions of saying, yes, 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 I believe in God. It's this real personal, powerful, emotional connection. And with that comes this idea that this individual connection leads to other sort of ways of thinking about individualism. So many of these Americans who are experiencing this, and this was throughout the colonies, so it was another sort of unifying system and unifying theme of these colonies, is really making Americans think, like maybe what I think about matters. Maybe my experiences are important. And this idea that someone across the ocean is controlling how I live, what I pay, who passes the laws in my town, is going to create a lot of frustration. And so the First Great Awakening is a really great way to think about the sort of addition of this kind of match that is lit by these preachers who start to say, hey, all the frustrations you're feeling, they're legitimate. That this king over the water, he is but, as Edwards famously says, they are but grasshoppers before God. They are nothing and less than nothing. And so this idea of divine right of kings starts to be rejected by all of these things. So I think I've covered most of the stuff. I'm happy to dig deeper if anyone wants any other videos. But just think about the sort of real connections to these sort of the moving from early English colonization to the rivalry with France to the individual colonies' experiences to this sort of mercantilist system of economic means to the frustration with that mercantilist system after salutary neglect and England trying to reassert its sovereignty, which leads to this real frustration combined with this sort of religious renaissance and rebirth of an awakening of individualism and connection to God and the rejection then of this authority across the water. So that's the basis of period 2. I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope this works for you, and let me know if you have any other questions. Bye.